Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of Daniel. We're now in chapter 11. We are starting from verse 17. Now, just a little recap. We need to realize that after Alexander the Great died, there were two major generals who had actually occupied a very important piece of real estate, one north of Israel and then one south of Israel. We always look at the reference point as Israel, and thereby we have Jerusalem as the focal. The one at the northern part, that would be the Seleucid Empire. The one at the southern part, that would be the Ptolemy Empire. Now, what's the difference between the two? In the Bible, as we read in Daniel chapter 11, our real focus is between these two dynasties, the Seleucid Empire and obviously the Ptolemy dynasty. Now, what we have that we left off in verse 16 is that we read about the king of the north, and we talk about king of the north, that is north of Israel, and that would be Antiochus the third. So I'll put here Antiochus the third, and we have Ptolemy the fourth. In the early days, Ptolemy had been victorious over the king of the north. But eventually, what happens is Antiochus III decided to venture down south. Whenever we talk about the entire kingdom of Ptolemy, it is not just Egypt, but all around Egypt, including what we call the promised land, the land of beauty, or what we call the land of pleasure, the glorious land in verse 16. So we have the Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, come down to disturb Ptolemy the fourth. And so we see this. And he will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom. And by talking about verse 17, we are talking about the king of the north. And one of the things that we try to understand is Antiochus III had always been on the losing end when he comes against Ptolemy the fourth. But now, as he comes down, he is coming with success. So what are we reading here is Antiochus is now successful against Ptolemy because Ptolemy is getting old, bringing with him a proposal of peace which he will put into effect. The idea here is he is coming and he is going to take over the land of Israel. That is how it can be understood. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. One of the things that we had talked about is this, that Antiochus III had actually introduced the, I guess you can say that the daughter by name of Cleopatra. The daughter of Antiochus was given to Ptolemy the fifth. Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanes. In the old days, you find that it is quite usual, quite normal, where families are united, where nations are united by way of a marriage. Antiochus III had hoped that his daughter Cleopatra would actually support Antiochus III's ambition to take over the southern kingdom. This is what is being spoken of by giving him the daughter, his daughter, to ruin the Ptolemy dynasty. What we do read is that Cleopatra did not follow or heed the father's interest. And so we read that she will not take a stand for the father to be on his side, to ruin the kingdom of the south. What we are told in the history books is that Cleopatra actually fell in love with Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanes, such that she will not betray the husband, but instead would not adhere to the original plan by siding with Antiochus III to take over the southern kingdom. Now, what we do read now in verse 18 is this. Verse 18 says that, and then after this failure, he will turn his face to the coastlands. Now, this word coastlands may be better understood as the isles, the islands. And where do we find islands? We find a lot of islands towards the Grecian Empire. Now, I would need now to explain when Antiochus III started to turn to the coastland and captured many of them. We find that the commander will put a stop to his taunting against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his taunting. Verse 18 basically says that Antiochus III was very insolent and he lost out. That's basically what the text is saying. And we need to pay attention to this commander. At this point in time, we should begin to understand that in this part of the world, the Romans, or let me put them here, the Roman Empire is starting to build themselves up. Nevertheless, we still have what we call Macedonia, we have Thrace, and we have Greece. And Antiochus III was interested to take that part of the world. And so he went ahead to conquer and try to capture the isles. A commander here is likely to be a Roman commander. That's right. What difference does this make? So the history books tells us that as Antiochus III started to move towards the eastern part of Europe, he actually came into alliance with a general from Carthage, and that would be Hannibal. And with that, he actually conquered Greece. By doing so, he started to upset the Roman Empire, thereby waking up the wrath of Rome. That is what we are talking about. And so verse 19 says, and then he will turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and not be found. Uh, Basically, what happened was he moved back to his own land. As he turned back towards his own land, he was assassinated. And so in verse 19, we have a number of things that we would like to understand. Antiochus was now facing the wrath of Rome. He came back to Syria and he was trying to find money to placate Rome. And while he was in Elam, uh, we read, at least in the history books, he disappeared. And so this idea here, not to be found, tells us that Antiochus III, for some reason, disappeared. He was trying to find money and was trying to placate Rome. And in so doing, he was likely to have been assassinated. But because we couldn't find his body, we don't know what happened. And so the Bible text says that he would stumble and fall and not be found. Uh, that is how the Jews would read this part of the history. We read in verse 20. Verse 20 is an and then. After Antiochus the third died. Now, let's first read this and then we will uh, talk about it. And then in his place, one will arise who will allow an oppressor to pass through the jewel of his kingdom. In verse 20, the glory of his kingship, that would be a good way of talking about it. Yet within a few days he would be broken, though not in anger nor in battle. Now, in verse 20, we have a very interesting understanding. And so let me just write this down on this side. Antiochus the third would be succeeded by his son Seleucus the third, the fourth, sorry, Seleucus the fourth Philopator. This is his elder son. But his reign was short-lived, few days, it says here, and it will be broken. His reign was relatively peaceful, but he had no money to pay the Romans. And the war debts accumulated by Antiochus will build. And so his main occupation was very much to collect money. The oppressor would be the Romans, if we want to understand it this way. And he would be overthrown. Now, how would he be overthrown? He will be broken, not in anger nor in battle. So he did not lose to somebody else, but he was assassinated. And the chief minister, uh, Heliodorus, took over. Now, Heliodorus is really not a king, but it is read here that he was assassinated and it was not the result of an opposing force. We come now to verse 21. After he died, in his place, so and then in his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the majesty of kingship has not been conferred. And then, so there's another and then here, he will come in a time of tranquility and then seize the kingdom by intrigue. Now, all of these has to do with Israel. So just bear with me. So after Seleucus IV was assassinated, the chief minister Heliodorus took over. But one of the things that we need to understand is that Heliodorus is not part of the reigning dynasty. Seleucus IV had a son. Seleucus IV's son is Demetrius. Demetrius was held ransom in Rome. That was why there's so much taxes being paid by the Seleucid Empire. Demetrius is one of the sons, and then what we see is Seleucus IV had another son, a child son, and the child son is called Antiochus, but he was a child at this time. So what happened here is Antiochus was too young to rule, and in his place, his uncle came about. His uncle was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and hereby we see the linkage. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a brother of Seleucus IV here, who is also the brother of Cleopatra. So Antiochus' uncle, Antiochus IV, decided to stay on the throne to be the, well, we can call the king in waiting for Antiochus because he was too young. And so Antiochus IV is known that he was not designated for the throne. So you can see the majesty of kingship is not conferred on him. And then he seized the kingdom by intrigue. So what really did happen was that we are told, at least from the, I guess, in the history books, the history books showed us that 6 years after the ascension to the throne, Antiochus, who is the young child, was assassinated. But the assassination was not done by Antiochus the fourth. The little child was assassinated while Antiochus the fourth was somewhere else, quelling an insurgency. So that is the backstory. I am trying to help us understand by this time, Antiochus IV eventually seized the kingdom after a death of Antiochus the child, the son of Seleucus IV. And by way of strength, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who is the brother of Cleopatra, was able now to be king of the Seleucid Empire. Now, that is where we are right now. So we come to verse 22. Verse 22 has, and then after he had this episode taking over the throne, the overflowing forces will be flooded away from him, and then broken, and also the Prince of the Covenant. Now, all of these are interesting. Now, what does this mean? We read in verse 22, of interest is this: Antiochus IV wanted to take over the promised land. He also wanted to take over the Ptolemy kingdom, the southern kingdom. He came to his sister. His sister is here, Cleopatra. Now, earlier on, Cleopatra had not sided with Antiochus III, his father, because she was in love with Ptolemy V. Now, the brother Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, came and made an alliance, a covenant. And so, verse 23, after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and then he will go up and then gain power with a small group of people. So the alliance was with Ptolemy V Epiphanes, between Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So now we have a very interesting progression of this relationship, that there is this loose arrangement, not so much as wanting to take over the southern kingdom or king of the south, but very much to pretend because of a relationship with Cleopatra. The intent of Antiochus IV was to take over everything. The Seleucid Empire's interest was to take over the entire kingdom of Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy had actually taken the control of the promised land, including all the surrounding lands, including Egypt and surrounding. And so the alliance was forged in hope that he would be weakened by his sister Cleopatra to loosen his power, so that Antiochus IV would be eventually the king of the entire kingdom, the larger part of Alexander the Great's kingdom. We read in verse 24. Verse 24 onwards is a time where he is trying to gain power. So, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest part of the realm, and then he will accomplish what his fathers did not, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunders, spoils, and possessions among them, and then he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a short period of time. We're all talking about Antiochus, the fourth Epiphanes. And then he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. By verse 25, he was going to take by force the king of the south. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. But he will not stand, and that would be Antiochus IV. He doesn't succeed because there were people behind in the Ptolemy kingdom that didn't want Antiochus IV to rule. And Antiochus was not successful in this war. And Ptolemy, well, I guess the Ptolemy, the sixth, would be acknowledged as the king. So from here on, we have Ptolemy the sixth. The successive dynasty was strong enough to withstand Antiochus the fourth. In verse 26, all of these says, those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. Basically, what happened is that In verse 26, this is a continuation of verse 25. What is happening is, by this time, the Roman Empire is starting to find its influence on the Ptolemy dynasty. Uh, the reason why I'm mentioning this is that behind all these back and forth with the king of the north and king of the south, the Roman Empire is starting to build its strength. And whoever Antiochus, the Seleucid Empire, was trying to gain control, the Roman Empire will come behind the opposing force to strengthen them. And so this is interesting. There will be a mighty army for war, and Antiochus the Fourth will not succeed. Verse 27. As for both kings, in both kings we have the two kings, Antiochus, this is Antiochus the Fourth, with Ptolemy the Sixth. These individuals are being spoken. Their hearts will be on evil, and then they will speak lies to each other at the same table. They may look like relatives, but they are not. And it will not succeed because the end is still to come at an appointed time. Verse 28. And then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. And then he will take action and then return to his own land. So the idea here is we find that Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes goes back literally empty-handed. Verse 29. The Holy Covenant is very much this area here, which is the Promised Land. Antiochus the Fourth wants the Promised Land, but at the appointed time, he will come back and come into the south, but this last time, it will not turn out the way it did before. The final time when Antiochus the Fourth comes down to the south, this time against Ptolemy the Sixth. We find in verse 30, for the ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will withdraw in fear and will return and curse the Holy Covenant and then take action. So what really did happen is this. It is understood by this time Kittim refers to the Roman forces. The Roman forces will come and support Ptolemy and will, well, I guess you can say, succeed over Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth. Now, what is going to happen is this. I just want to draw your attention to this part of the map. We find that as Antiochus the Fourth is coming back, he will come through Jerusalem, which is called the Holy Covenant. And this time round, he takes action. And we will talk about the actions. He will come back and you pay attention to those who abandon the Holy Covenant. This is important. What is this that we are talking about? As Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes comes back, he launches a program in the Promised Land. The program is a program to Hellenize the Jewish nation. This episode is now described in verse 31. We look at 31 before we end today. As he comes back, and then pay attention to those who abandon the Holy Covenant. The Holy Covenant really refers to the Holy Covenant with God. But these are the ones who are Hellenized. Now, Hellenization is a program by Antiochus IV Epiphanes to change their behavior and their culture and their thinking and their lives, to make the Jews into Greeks. The forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and then do away with the regular sacrifice, and then they will set up the abomination of desolation. The idea here is this. So let me slowly unpack this. The Holy Covenant with God is going to be desecrated. The Seleucid army will come and he will desecrate, defile the temple. And this is the second temple. How will he defile the temple? He defiles the temple by making a sacrifice of unclean animals on the altar. And so on the altar, he actually sacrificed a pig, and that's an unclean animal. He will do away with the regular sacrifice because Hellenizing them is not merely making them look like Greeks, dress like Greeks, eat like Greeks, but really to abandon the temple worship and abandon everything they know about the covenant with God. And so the regular sacrifice in the temple was also abolished. Very similar to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. The understanding of abomination of desolation, as is translated here, is really not desolation in our normal sense of the word. The word desolation is shocking, stunned, silence. And so this abomination, by way of understanding, by when you read in the book of Exodus, abomination means idol. So what really does this represent is that there is now an idol that's going to stun and shock people. This is an idol called a silent idol, shocking idol of Zeus that was erected in the temple area. This is the shock. So in the temple area, there was the image of Zeus. So two things had really happened. There is a cessation of whatever they do in the temple with regards to the offering and the sacrifices. The Hellenizing is very complete, where many of the Jews abandon temple worship and embrace the Greek way of life, the Greek belief system, the Greek deities. They spoke Greek instead of uh, Hebrew. The temple was no longer in function because the armies would come and stop all of the sacrifices. They would come and they had slaughtered a pig on the altar. There, and that was the desecration. They had erected an idol that was shockingly the idol of Zeus. And and by way of history, this episode is incredibly important. And you find this documented in the book of Maccabees, the first Maccabees. And you find the first Maccabees being a very interesting history book that talks about this. And the Maccabean brothers rose up and fought against Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Uh, but little do we realize it was not just that. The Maccabean brothers, they were from the Levitical order, and they actually went out to remove all the Hellenized Jews, the Jews that had abandoned the Torah, abandoned the temple, abandoned the Jewish culture, abandoned the offerings, the sacrifices, abandoned the language, abandoned everything with regards to the covenant with God. And so, in the minds of the Maccabean revolt, they find that these people have abandoned God and so they deserve to die. The Maccabean revolt was two-pronged. One is to push back the Antiochus IV, and the second is to remove all the Hellenized Jews that had supported the abandoning of the temple. So, with this, I hope that you have a better idea, uh, because chapter 11 of Daniel is somewhat complicated, somewhat a bit of storytelling, somewhat trying to map with the history of the then period. And it is fascinating as well of how it would map to a number of these events that had you not been there, it would have been impossible for a human being to write Daniel chapter 11. And that's why people who oppose prophecies usually say that this is written during the Roman Empire days. But because this was written by Daniel, spoken by the angel Gabriel, and we are seeing this as a divine prophecy, and that this book was actually presented to Alexander the Great, then we see that this book is actually divinely inspired prophetic words. So we would read it forward and not read it as a point of after the fact. It is surprisingly accurate. And so what I've tried to show you is how well it maps to the known history of this period. And we end here in verse 31, speaking about Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, how he, on the way back from a losing venture in the Egypt, on the way back to Syria, he did all these unspeakable things because he really wanted to control the promised land. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.